Hello guys and gals, and welcome to the first episode of Support Gems. So I thought it would be a pretty neat idea if I went over all the support gems and talked about like their usefulness within the game and what you could potentially get out of them. Today we're going to be going over a very simple support gem. We're going to start off easy for me, and we're going to go over Scattershot. Scattershot is an interesting support gem that basically gives you the ability to add an additional projectile to your attack. It does have some negatives as well as some positives, and let's go over the negatives and the positives together, and we're going to talk about it. So first off, let's take a look at an ability like Frostbolt. I currently have like 2 projectiles guaranteed, and I can have up to 4 cast from my particular ability, depending on my percent chance. I think I have like a 50% chance right now to get 2 additional projectiles. Now, Scattershot will give me even more projectiles, so I can potentially get an additional, one more projectile? So we go from, so we go from 2, let's see here. Yeah, we go from a guaranteed 2 to a guaranteed 4, at which point we can also potentially get 2 extra projectiles on top of that, so we can potentially get our proc cast of our additional projectiles, which you can see ends up being 6, because we're getting quite a few extra projectiles there. It is a very interesting ability, and it can be very powerful, but it's also important to note how it can potentially ruin your build if you're not careful. Now, the first thing that you have to figure out is whether or not your ability can actually hit a target multiple times. And this is important. So adding more projectiles doesn't necessarily immediately mean more damage. If we were to, say, like run this on a little notepad here, and let's just pretend you're doing like, I don't know, let's say 200 damage per projectile, right? So projectile. Well, if you have 5 projectiles, that's 5 times 200, which, you know, could potentially equal, what, 1,000? Which is going to give you an increase in damage. However, some abilities cannot hit a monster multiple times. And generally, if you have an ability that can hit a monster multiple times with the same effect, it usually tells you that. Like, for instance, if you take a look at something like the crossbow abilities, and you look at, say, Ice Shards or Incendiary Shot. Yeah, Incendiary Shot. So Incendiary Shot says multiple fragments can hit the same target. And this means that you can, in fact, deal multiple hits of damage to the same target with multiple projectiles. Or if you take a look at something more recent, like Twister, Twister specifically tells you that twisters fired at the same time can hit the same target no more than once every 0.66 seconds. So in other words, you can't really hit the target a large number of times with an ability like Twisters, so having more Twisters might not necessarily equal more damage because you can't really hit the target more than a certain number of times per second with those Twisters. On top of this, it also comes with negatives. Now it says supported skills deal 35% less damage. Now it's very important that you understand that less damage is a lot of the reduction. If you look at my damage output right now, I'm 422 DPS, which isn't really that high, but I'm also only level 46, so keep that in mind. Now, if I put this Scattershot on my ability, you'll notice that my DPS now goes down to 220. I've basically halved my DPS. It also comes with supported skills have 20% less attack and cast speed. This means that not only am I getting off less cast per second, as you can see here, I go from 1.76 cast per second to 1.41 cast per second, but I'm also going down in damage from 258 total damage to 168 total damage. So I'm losing speed and I am losing actual damage to gain these additional projectiles. So you have to ask yourself when you're using this ability, this support gem, is this worth it for your character? Can you actually hit with multiple projectiles? Because if you think about it from a certain perspective, right? If I go from 258, and I only have 1 projectile, right? So 258 with 1 projectile is just going to be 258 damage, right? However, if I'm going from 258 to 168 times 3 projectiles, because remember, I still get my original 1, and I get 2 additional projectiles. So that's 504 damage if I can hit the target with all 3 projectiles. If I can't hit the target with all 3 projectiles, then this becomes, well, just an extreme negative on my overall damage output. It can have utility. One of the things that I was using it for early on in my Twister character was just simply to get the frozen ground. And adding in something like this allowed me to get multiple frozen grounds, so it was all over the place, which would allow me to use my Twisters much easier to get the cold imbuement. So sometimes you might not necessarily care about the damage or the decrease to the cast speed, and maybe you just need additional projectiles to provide, say, frozen ground. Or maybe you need, like additional projectiles to freeze a target, burn a target, poison a target, bleed a target, whatever it may be that you're trying to do, shock a target. So if you think about Scattershot from a standpoint of utility, it can be very good for utility. It can also be very bad for damage, or it could be very good for damage, depending on if you are getting an increase in your total damage output by using this ability. My personal opinion is that Scattershot is generally not good unless the ability can actually hit and deal damage with both projectiles. Now, one thing that it will allow you to do is it will allow you to gain additional clear time. Now, obviously, having more projectiles is definitely going to be better for clearing than having less projectiles, right? So if you're dealing with large groups of monsters and you're just trying to dish out as much damage as you possibly can to large groups of monsters, Scattershot can come in handy for that reason. But keep in mind that there are other ways that you can increase your projectiles, like, for instance, this character, which has a absolutely crazy number of projectiles, and there are ways that don't necessarily cost you extra damage output. Like, for instance, Wild Shards, which can just simply add a huge number of projectiles to your attack every, 20% of the time, right? And this is kind of like where Scattershot lies on the entire topic, is that sometimes it's useful and sometimes it is very not useful. So one of the best things I can tell you is that you really need to figure out whether A, your ability can actually hit multiple times, B, whether the damage decrease and the attack speed decrease is actually worth it, and C, whether or not the 2 extra projectiles is not something that you could get from other places. Let me give you some examples. If you're a spellcaster, you can potentially use this section, which is 4% chance to fire 2 additional projectiles. There's also 4, 4, 12, 6, and 6. And then up here, there is another percent chance to fire additional projectiles, which is another 6, 6, and 6, which you can get additional projectiles here. You can also potentially add in more projectile speed or less projectile speed as you might particularly want on your character. Less projectile speed can come in handy for some things, and higher projectile speed can come in handy for other things. Depends on what you're trying to do. There's also the Deadeye Ascendancy, which can also give you an additional projectile through endless munitions. And on top of that, there are bows that can give you additional projectiles, such as the Twin Bow, which, do we have one of the Twin Bows in here? No, we do not. Of course we don't have a twin bow in here. I guess I can't shop at any of the NPCs here either. Wonder if I have one of them laying around somewhere. I've been hoarding equipment. There you go. So this one is a base type that makes it fire an additional arrow. There are also other modifiers that you can get on bows that I believe it's just like a random modifier that also has it apply an additional arrow. And so what I'm trying to say here is that although Scattershot is interesting, There are other ways to get the projectile increase, and like things like Sire of Shards, which gives you 4 additional projectiles, the Gemini bow, which can give you 1 additional projectile, random modifiers on the bows, which can give you additional projectiles. You can also get additional projectiles from things like the Psychic Fragmentation, the additional spell projectiles up here. There are also additional spell projectile or like arrow projectiles that you can get in various places around the board. I can't remember exactly all the locations that give you additional arrows, but if you take a look around the board, you will definitely find the ones that give you additional shots. I believe here is one that gives you additional projectiles when forking. There's also additional projectiles. Yeah, additional projectiles when forking. There's a bunch of them there. Trying to think if there's any others that I'm missing. The search function on this passive tree is just so amazing. Can you tell the sarcasm in my voice? It would be really nice if the search function worked better on the passive tree. It would definitely make things easier. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it for Scattershot. It's definitely an interesting one, but it's also one that comes with a lot of negatives, and you definitely want to watch out for those negatives because you could potentially be adding projectiles in with no gain whatsoever, depending on the ability that you're using, if you cannot hit the target with more than 1 projectile at a time. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining me. Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.